scenario, and so the ninth fisherman eventually goes under and isn't competitive anymore, so he goes under, and now you've got 3 people who are being fed by the taxes that are being pulled out of these fishing companies. So you can see how what happens is when you give an incentive to not be working, then eventually people are going to start taking advantage of that incentive, and you're going to have more people not working. And so what's eventually going to happen is you're going to have 1 fisherman and 10 unemployed people, and then when that 1 fisherman goes out of business, you don't have any fish left, and you've got a system where you can't produce wealth anymore. Everybody's going to have their ticket for fish, their meal ticket from the government, but there's not going to be any fish on the shelves when you go to the store because all the fishermen are out of business. So that's another thing we need to think of when we start talking about actually creating real wealth. If we were to not give that incentive to be unemployed, then those people would be more likely, especially since that tax would never happen on these successful fish businesses, they could potentially hire this person, and now you've got people who can take care of themselves. Everybody's got a job and a successful business, and you don't have this incentive to get out of business and get onto welfare. And that's the way a lot of these programs work. So let's talk about a couple ways that the government can get this money back. The first way is they can actually tax the private sector. And the thing I actually like about this is that it's an honest way of dealing with our problems. All right, we say, okay, here's our government that's got $12 trillion in debt, and we're just going to tax the people. So the people can see what the job is ahead of them, you can schedule it out, and we can get down to the good hard business of paying off our debt. The bad news is, raising taxes obviously is going to continue to hurt the ability of companies to be successful. So you're probably going to see at this point, when you're trying to do so much with this debt and paying it off in a time when the economy's gone down anyhow, then you've got a lot of risk there. When you're raising taxes in the middle of people who have more companies that are on the margin, you're going to see more people go under. So that's going to be a tough decision to make, but it's an honest decision. At least we're tackling something up front and saying this is how we're going to pay it off. The second way that the government, given that we have a fiat system, I'm going to call it an indirect way of dealing with the issue, is that we've got the Fed, and we can have the Fed just print off money like crazy. It's not actually value that's coming from the private sector, people who are creating stuff and creating value, which the money is a reflection of, but you've actually got the Fed just with a printing press just printing off money like crazy. So that's probably part of what's been going on, but let's just assume that the government, promises not to raise taxes, so they're going to have to do it another way, which would be to print off all this money. So let's say we take for example, our $1.5 trillion in stimulus, and we just do it all through the Fed, and we print off $1.5 trillion, and there's our stimulus money. Well, what that creates is inflation, and the reason I say that's an indirect way of dealing with the situation is because you're not really creating real wealth to pay off your debt. You're just creating a bunch of paper money, and what that does is that dilutes the value of all the money in the system. So it's like a hidden tax, because what happens is when my purchasing power of my money goes down because it's being diluted by all this extra money that's being printed off, then prices rise. So when my dollar doesn't buy, I used to be able to get a candy bar for 35 cents when I was a kid. Now I have to pay $1.05 for the same candy bar. So that's an example of how inflation, is causing prices to go up. In fact, the dollar has inflated by, I think, 95% since the Fed was created in 1913. And the period from the beginning of the country up until 1913, so from the 1700s up through 1913, the dollar actually appreciated by about 12-13%. And in the almost 100 years that we've had the Fed, the dollar has depreciated by 95%. So you need $20 today to buy something that only cost $1 back in 1913. So anyhow, it's an indirect way of dealing with things, and the reason I don't like that approach is because it's kind of like getting sideswiped. The Fed is a secret agency. They create the money and they give it to whoever they want, but they're not auditable. They're not accountable to anybody in the public, so we don't know what the Fed's doing with all this money. We presume that they're somehow helping to stimulate the economy, but I haven't heard anybody on the radio lately saying that they're getting a great benefit from the stimulus package. So I wonder where all this money's going that they're printing off with the Fed. One thing that's happening is the Fed gives money to the banks. Now, the banks actually aren't lending that money out right now, and in a weird kind of way, that's actually really good for the public right now, because the banks, once they do let this money into the system, that's when the trickle-down effect and the inflation is going to kick in. So long as what they're doing here is they're creating money out of thin air, and in some cases it's just keystrokes on a computer. So the Fed says, okay, this bank gets $1 million, so I'll give them, plus $1 million on this chart and minus $1 million on this chart, and we'll just do it all electronically. So it's just keystrokes and numbers. It's not real wealth that's created by people working and earning wealth. And the other thing that happens is right now the Fed's rates are so low, 0 to 1%. So the bank gets all this money. Let's say that the bank gets $100 million, $100 million, and they only have to pay 1% on it. Well, the other thing the bank can do is they can actually go to another bank somewhere else in the world that might have a different interest rate. So maybe they've got 4 or 5% there. So the bank can literally create money out of thin air, take $100 million at 1%, invest it over here, loan it over here at 4%, and they can make 3% on the deal. So banks are literally generating wealth off of interest on money that's just keystrokes on a computer. It's not real money, because we have a fiat system where there actually is no value behind this money. So the banks don't have an incentive to lend money to people if they, tough times are happening right now. So there's no incentive for the banks to do a risky loan out to the private sector when they can make a good percentage off of just doing loans with other banks. So that's another way this money system just isn't working. I don't think it's honest. And when we finally do get the inflation of the banks lending money into the private system, that's going to be like a side swipe to everybody. It's kind of like in a football game when I'm playing an offensive line. If I get taxed, it's like I can see the guy who I'm blocking against. But if inflation comes in, it's like a guy coming in and sideswiping me and taking out my knees, and the next thing you know, I'm out for the season because I didn't see that coming. Likewise with inflation, people don't know if it's coming or not, so how can they plan their budgets for every month? If food prices just go up and nobody's expecting it, then that causes a lot of problems, especially for people living on the margin right now. So I think it's really important that we create some accountability or some visibility of what the Fed's doing with all this money that they're printing off. And another solution, since we're talking about the problems with the US dollar here, is to actually tie the dollar to something of real value. So right now you can circulate money around between the Fed and the banks, which is fake wealth. It's not real wealth. It's just zeros on a computer or paper money being printed and floated back and forth. If you actually tie the dollar to something of value, let's say the dollar is a reflection of a bunch of bananas,